Imagine a successful factory that makes a product everyone wants. The CEO is a genius, the shareholders are rich, the employees get bonuses. Inside the four walls of that factory, everything looks like a massive win. But there's a pipe coming out the back of the building, and that pipe is dumping toxic sludge into the river. 10 miles downstream, there's a farmer. He doesn't work at the factory. He doesn't buy the product. He doesn't own stock of that company. But suddenly, all of his crops are dying. His water is poisoned. The factory owner is counting his profits. The farmer is counting his losses. The factory owner gets the benefit. The farmer pays the cost. In economics, there's a name for this. It's called externality. This would be a negative externality. It's what happens when a transaction between two people forces a cost or a benefit onto a third person who didn't ask for it. The illustration I just gave you is a common example used in economics textbooks to explain externalities. In fact, if you put economic externalities into ChatGPT, it will probably give you that example. But for me and my family, it hits a lot closer to home. I want to take you to a place that's very special to the Crockett family. We own a beach house on a small remote island in South Carolina called Daufuskie Island. There's no bridge to get there. You have to take a boat. So it's a place frozen in time with a private beach. We love it. We spend most of the summer there. My wife and 5 kids sing many of the Sundays in one of the oldest churches in the Southeast. There's one church on the island, First Union African Baptist Church. It was founded in 1881 by descendants of slaves shortly after the American Civil War. It's home to an incredible church of those still living on this quiet island. We love attending that gospel preaching church and have so many friends on the island, but Daufuskie wasn't always quiet. Back in the early 1900s, the island was booming. It was at the heart of the oyster industry. Daufuskie oysters, world renowned. They were on the menus of the finest restaurants in New York and Paris, and the people who built this economy were the Gullah people, descendants of enslaved Africans who had stayed on the island. They were hardworking, self-sufficient. They had a thriving community built on those waters. At one point, Daufuskie oysters employed over 2,500 people. Now, some of those lived in Savannah and surrounding islands, but then something happened up the river. Big factories in the cities began to grow. They were signs of progress, but those factories, and particularly a huge paper mill, dumped their industrial waste into the water. The factory owners in the city looked at their spreadsheets and they saw massive profits. They were successful, but downstream, the water around Daufuskie Island turned toxic. The amazing oysters, the lifeblood of the island, began to die or became very unsafe to eat. Because of all that pollution, the economy of Daufuskie collapsed. Families who had lived there for generations were forced to leave the island just to survive. The population decimated. Most of them went to Savannah or Tybee Island or Hilton Head. That's a real life example of negative externality. The factory owners got the profit. The Gullah families paid the price. The factory owners kept their jobs. The islanders lost their homes. My wife and I look at the island today, and even though it's slowly rebuilding, it's only a fraction of what it was in the glory days as far as number of people living on the island. We're literally looking at the scars of someone else's success. Christian leader, I want you to hear me. You might not be dumping chemicals into a river, but every decision you make travels downstream. To business owners, if you squeeze your suppliers so hard they go out of business just so you can save a penny, you're creating a Daufuskie Island. You're winning, but they're dying. To pastors, if you build a massive church platform on the backs of unpaid volunteers who are burning out and neglecting their own children, you're creating a negative externality. You get the applause, those families get the silence of an absentee parent. The Bible takes this incredibly seriously. Look at the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21. Ahab wants a vineyard. He takes it. He gets what he wants, but the cost was an innocent man's life. The cost was the integrity of the throne. You can't calculate your success only by looking at your own bank account or your own attendance numbers. You have to look downstream. Who's paying for your profit? Who's crying because you're celebrating? In the kingdom of God, a win that destroys your neighbor is not a win. It's a sin. Now you might be saying, I'm a pastor, I'm a stay-at-home mom, or I run a marketing agency. I don't own a toxic factory. I get that, but every decision you make, how you run your staff meeting, how you discipline your kids, how you handle stress at 5 p.m. has a pipe running out the back. I'm talking to you today because you might be profitable in your public life, but toxic downstream in your private life. You might be hitting all your KPIs, but bankrupting your family's emotional health. Today, we're going to look at the economics of loving your neighbor. We're going to see that God holds you responsible not just for the transaction, but for the ripple effect. If you want to be a kingdom leader, you have to stop asking, does this work for me? And start asking, who's paying for this? So let's talk about the hidden tax. If we define clearly, a negative externality is when you take an action that harms someone else and you don't pay for it, they do. It's secondhand smoke. The smoker gets the nicotine buzz, the person standing next to them gets the cough. Christian leader, I need you to look at your life. Where are you generating secondhand smoke? Let's talk to business owners and entrepreneurs entrepreneurs first. You drive your team hard, you demand excellence, you get the project done under budget, you win the award, but your team's burnt out. Their marriages are straining because they're answering your emails at 9 p.m. You achieved the goal, profit, but you offloaded the cost, stress, onto their families. That's a negative externality. You stole peace from a home you don't even live in. Let's talk to parents. You had a hard day at work. You come home, you're short-tempered, you snap at your spouse, you yell at the kids for leaving their shoes in the hallway. You're venting your stress. You feel a little better because you got it out, but your child is now anxious. They're paying the tax for your bad day. Is this biblical? Well, yeah, the Bible takes this incredibly seriously, right? Look at the story of Achan in Joshua chapter 7. Israel conquers Jericho. God says, don't take any gold or silver. It's devoted to me. Achan sees a beautiful robe and some gold. He takes it. He hides it in his tent. He thinks, hey, this is a private transaction. It's just me and the gold. But what happens? Israel goes in the next battle of Ai. They get slaughtered. 36 men die. 36 wives become widows. 36 sets of children become fatherless. Why? Because of one man's private decision. Achan created a massive negative externality. He thought his sin was private, but the cost was public. Numbers 32:23 says, be sure your sin will find you out. And Achan and his whole family end up dying because of Achan's sin. Often before your sin finds you out, it finds out your neighbor. I want to ask you a hard question. If we audited the people around you, your staff, your spouse, your students, what's the cost of being in proximity to you? Do they have to pay a patience tax because you're always late? Do they have to pay an anxiety tax because you're disorganized? Okay, what's the solution? Economists have a solution for pollution. They tax it. They force the factory to pay for a filter. They make the factory internalize the externality. Basically, if you make the mess, you have to pay to clean it up. Jesus said the same thing, but he used different words. Matthew 22:39, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Think about that through an economic lens. Loving your neighbor means I treat your cost as if they're my cost. It means I treat your happiness as if it were my happiness. If I love you as myself, I won't dump my toxic sludge in your river, because if it poisons your water, it poisons my water. That's the definition of Christian maturity, the willingness to absorb the cost so that others don't have to. I mean, look at Jesus. The cross is the ultimate example of internalizing the externality. We created the debt, sin. We created the pollution, death. By all rights, we should have paid the cost, but Jesus stepped in. He took the toxic sludge of the world on himself. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake, God made him to be sin for us, even though Jesus knew no sin. He paid a cost he didn't owe so we could get a benefit we didn't earn. As a leader, you're called to follow that pattern. If you're a boss, internalizing the cost means you take the blame when things go wrong and you give the credit when things go right. You absorb the pressure so your team can work in peace. If you're a pastor, it means you do your own emotional work and therapy so you don't bleed on your congregation from the pulpit. Not that you have to have a therapist, but you pay the cost of healing so they don't have to pay the cost of your brokenness, right? When you stop forcing others to pay for your actions, you start becoming a better shepherd. Here's the beautiful news though. Externalities are not always bad. There's such a thing as a positive externality. That's when your actions create a benefit for someone who didn't pay for it. The classic example is a beekeeper, right? The beekeeper keeps bees to make honey to sell for profit. That's his business. But the bees don't stay in the hive. They fly next door to the neighbor's apple orchard. They pollinate trees. The neighbor gets a massive crop of apples for free, just because he lives next to a beekeeper. That's what God calls you to be, a spillover blessing. Look at Genesis 39. Joseph is a slave in Potiphar's house. Verse 5 says, from the time that Potiphar made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. Potiphar wasn't a believer. He didn't worship Yahweh, but his stocks went up. His crops grew. His house was peaceful. Why? Because he was standing next to Joseph. Joseph was a positive externality. I want to speak to you Christian business owners. Do your non-Christian employees make more money because they work for you? Do they learn how to be better fathers because they watch how you treat your family? If you run a coffee shop, does the block look cleaner? Does the property value of the neighborhood go up because you're there? Jeremiah 29:7 tells the exiles in Babylon, seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For its welfare, you will find your welfare. In its welfare. God's telling them, be such a blessing that even your captors prosper. This is the most powerful evangelism strategy in the world. When people look at your life, they should think, I don't know if I believe what he believes. I don't know if I like his theology, but boy, oh boy, my life is better because he's my neighbor. To the teacher, your positive externality is the confidence a student carries for the rest of their life because you believed in them for that year. To the entrepreneur, your positive externality is the charity you support, the ethical supply chain you build, the families that you feed. You're called to be a fountain, not a drain. So here's the challenge. Your life is not a vacuum. You're constantly radiating effects, either toxic smoke or fresh air. I want you to do an audit this week. Ask the Holy Spirit to show you the pipe coming out of the back of your life. Ask, Lord, who's paying the price for my sin and who's reaping the benefit of my obedience? Don't be the factory that poisons the river. Be the tree planted by the water, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. Your actions matter more than you know, not just for you, but for everybody standing downstream. I hope that this video was helpful to you. Hopefully it gave you a lot to think about. I'm enjoying going through different economic principles and trying to apply those to Christian leaders. If you liked it, maybe give it a thumbs up or share it with a friend or subscribe to the channel. Thanks again for your time. And I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful day rejoicing in Jesus.